A 60th birthday gala. My mother-in-law. I wasn't invited, but I was ordered to pay the $5,000 bill. My mother-in-law, Carol, was throwing herself a lavish 60th birthday party but didn't invite me. As I was at home eating a sad bowl of instant ramen, my husband called, demanding I come down to the venue and pay the outstanding balance of $5,000. I let out a cold laugh, then did one thing that terrified my husband's family to their core. The story I'm about to tell happened on the 60th birthday of my mother-in-law, Carol Thompson. A day that should have been a happy occasion, a day for children and grandchildren to gather and celebrate, instead became the turning point that transformed me from the patient daughter-in-law I had been for the past 8 years. For the entire week prior, our house was a constant buzz of discussion. My mother-in-law paced back and forth, a small notebook in her hand, her mouth constantly on the phone. Make sure we get the largest ballroom at the Grandview Hotel. Yes, the birthday cake must be 5 tiers to look magnificent. The MC has to emphasize that this is a milestone 60th birthday celebration. My husband, Mark Thompson, eagerly accompanied his mother, helping her try on designer dresses, ordering elaborate floral arrangements, and printing invitations for relatives from both sides of the family. I heard everything, I saw everything. But not once did anyone ask me a single thing. No one told me what I would be wearing that night, which table I would be sitting at, or even if I was coming at all. I calmed myself, maybe they're just busy. Maybe they'll tell me later. But as the day drew closer, I became increasingly aware that there was no place for me in their grand plan. That morning, I still woke up at 5:30 a.m. as usual. I made breakfast, did the laundry, and cleaned the house. My mother-in-law walked past me, uttering only a single sentence. Make sure the house is spotless today. Not a single word of reminder that she would be celebrating her birthday that evening. After breakfast, my husband also left immediately, without a single glance in my direction. My heart felt strange, a heavy knot in my stomach. But I kept trying to convince myself. Maybe they just forgot to tell me. That afternoon, as I opened the closet to fold clothes, I froze. The expensive bespoke silk shirt I had bought Mark for our anniversary last year was gone. A pair of leather shoes I had just polished to a high shine had also vanished. I picked up my phone and sent him a text. Mark, are you going somewhere tonight? His reply came almost instantly, just 3 words. Just stay home. I read it over and over. My heart sank. Just stay home. As a wife, I was supposed to stay home on my mother-in-law's birthday. At 7 p.m., the house was dead silent. From the street outside, I could hear the sound of cars and people laughing. They were all probably heading to the Grandview Hotel ballroom, where the birthday party was underway. And me, I was sitting alone in the cold kitchen. In front of me was a bowl of instant ramen I had just prepared. The broth was already cold, the noodles swollen and soft. I ate it slowly, a lump forming in my throat. 8 years as a daughter-in-law, I had once thought I was part of this family. But now, I felt like a stranger. Just as I put down the bowl, the phone rang. It was Mark. I answered. Before I could even speak, his irritated voice came through. Get down to the Grandview right now. Bring your debit card. Pay the party bill, it's $5,000. I thought I had misheard. What, Mark? I asked again. He snapped. The party bill is short $5,000. Hurry up and pay it. They're waiting. I fell silent. So they threw a lavish birthday party for his mother, invited all the relatives. Guests were arriving, but they didn't invite me. Only at the last minute, when they needed someone to pay, did they remember me. I asked, my voice trembling but trying to stay calm, why wasn't I invited? Mark answered without a shred of hesitation. Mom said, tonight's guests are all very important people. You should just stay home so you don't cause any trouble. Those 2 words, cause trouble, felt like a slap across my face. I have a career, I support myself. I dress respectably, but in their eyes, I was just an embarrassment. I sat there in silence, hearing the loud music from his end of the phone, the voice of the MC giving a speech, and the sound of applause. Mark urged again. Hurry up, don't embarrass me. I stared at the bowl of instant ramen in front of me. The broth was completely cold. The whole kitchen was lit by a single dim, yellow light. I suddenly understood one thing. In their eyes, I wasn't a daughter-in-law, not a wife. I was just a walking wallet. I laughed cynically, a laugh that sounded foreign even to me. For 8 years, whenever the family needed money for home renovations, a nephew's wedding costs, or a celebratory dinner, I had always quietly provided it. I thought it was my duty. I thought that as a family, we should help one another. But on my mother-in-law's 60th birthday, I didn't have the right to sit at the same table. I only had the obligation to pay. Mark, on the other end, was getting impatient. Did you hear me? Bring the card here now. I took a deep breath and then answered slowly. Mark, go on and enjoy the party. I'm busy. He shouted. Don't you be unreasonable. I said nothing more, just calmly ended the call. The kitchen was silent again. I looked at the ramen bowl, then at the house I had helped buy with my own money over the years. Right then, I decided to do something my husband's entire family could never have imagined. They thought I would rush over, smile awkwardly, and pull out my card to save their face. But that night, not only would that $5,000 remain unpaid, but it would also unleash a surprise that would make them realize my patience was not a weakness. And when a woman who has been taken for granted for too long finally stands up, the price they have to pay will be anything but small. After hanging up the phone, I sat in silence for a long time. Not because I was scared, but because fragments of old memories suddenly surfaced in my mind, as if life wanted to remind me that what happened tonight was no accident. It was the culmination of countless times I had forced myself to think, just given a little for the sake of peace at home. 8 years ago, I met Mark at a corporate networking event. At the time, I was a finance manager at a major construction firm. A stable job, more than enough income. I wasn't the type to show off, but to be honest, my family also came from a good background. My parents owned a successful local hardware store, built on honest business and decades of careful saving. I was raised with the teaching that money is important, but what's more important is how you live with integrity and good manners. Mark, at the time, worked in the technical department of a subcontractor. He wasn't a smooth talker, nor was he good at charming people. He was quiet and hardworking. Whenever he spoke, he always looked you in the eye with sincerity. Once, I was driving home late from a business trip, and my car broke down in the middle of the road. It was Mark who came, driving over 10 miles to help me. Afterward, he just said gently, "It's dangerous driving alone at night. Next time, if anything happens, just call me." I once thought a man like this would be a solid pillar to lean on. We had a quiet courtship. Mark often took me to simple diners and food trucks. We'd sit on a park bench, drinking sodas and laughing like kids. He often said, "I'm not rich, but I'll work hard so you'll never lack for anything." It sounded simple, but at the time, I believed him because I didn't need a rich man. I needed a man with a good heart. The day Mark introduced me to his family, I still remember it clearly. Their house wasn't large, located on a narrow street with faded paint and old furniture. His mother, Carol Thompson, greeted me with a very warm smile. Her voice was so sweet. "My house is simple, dear, but we live with a lot of love. Now that you're here, I'll treat you like my own daughter." She served me a piece of pot roast, poured me a drink, and asked just enough questions. I saw sincerity, or at least I thought it was sincerity. She even added a sentence that warmed my heart. "A daughter leaves her family to be with her husband. It requires a lot of sacrifice. But don't you worry, I won't let you suffer." At that moment, I saw Mark, sitting across from me, just looking down and smiling shyly. I thought how lucky a woman would be to meet such an understanding family. Our wedding was modest. My parents covered most of the costs because they loved me. My mother even advised me. The most important thing in marriage is maintaining harmony. But harmony must be based on respect. I nodded, feeling like I understood. But in reality, I didn't fully grasp then that respect sometimes doesn't come from words, but from how people treat you in the smallest of ways. After we got married, Mark and I lived separately for the first year. That was the most peaceful time of my life. We both worked. In the evenings, we'd have dinner together, watch TV, and talk about trivial things. Mark had a habit of neatly arranging his shoes by the door, while I liked to keep the kitchen spotless. We argued, but we always made up. I thought I had chosen the right person. Until one day, my mother-in-law had a minor stroke. She wasn't paralyzed, but her walking became slower, and she sometimes felt tired when she spoke. Mark said to me worriedly, "Mom's all alone at home, I can't rest easy. How about we ask her to live with us for a while?" I couldn't bear to refuse. I was a daughter too. I understood the fear that comes when parents start to age and fall ill. I agreed, even proactively preparing a room for her and buying a more comfortable bed. When she moved in, I continued to be a good daughter-in-law. In the morning, I'd prepare warm water for her. During the day, I'd cook soft foods, and at night, I'd ask if she was tired. At first, she still seemed considerate, often saying, "Oh, I'm being such a bother. Let me do it myself." I heard her and felt relieved. But just a few weeks later, the atmosphere in the house began to change. Carol slowly started taking an interest in things she had never asked about before. She'd ask, "How much is your salary? How much was your bonus this month? And whose name is the savings account under?" At first, I felt awkward, just smiling and replying, "Oh, it's enough, Mom." She would smile back warmly, but her eyes would study me sharply. "Yes. I'm just asking so I can help plan the family finances. A husband and wife need a plan." Then she began to interfere in small decisions. Even buying a new pot prompted questions about why I didn't buy a cheaper one. Going to a friend's wedding reception was questioned as a waste of money. I tried to talk to Mark gently, telling him his mother was asking too many questions about our finances. He just sighed. "She's old, just be patient with her." Hearing that sentence once, I could accept it. But after hearing it repeatedly, I realized it wasn't advice. It was Mark's way of avoiding taking a stand to please his mother. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it's just a generational difference. Maybe she's worried about her son. Maybe she's afraid I'm wasteful. I thought everything would be fine. She would come to understand me, and our family would be peaceful again. But I didn't know that my patience was being interpreted as something else entirely. It wasn't seen as kindness. It was seen as weakness. And once people see you as weak, they will start testing just how far you can be pushed before they finally remove you from the party table, just like tonight. I started to see that change clearly in the smallest of things. So small that if I told someone else, they might say, "You're making a big deal out of nothing." But that's how a marriage works. It doesn't break from one big storm. It cracks from the tiny scratches that happen every day, until you realize it's already too late. After my mother-in-law moved in, Carol developed a strange habit. She wouldn't ask, she wouldn't demand, nor would she outright say she needed money. She would just look around and make a few passing comments. "Medical bills are so expensive these days, aren't they?" Or, "The neighbor next door joined an investment club and is making a huge profit." People who are smart with their money really get ahead. I heard her, but still thought she was just venting. I never suspected that these complaints were her way of testing me, to see if I would take the initiative to give her money. Then one morning, I opened my banking app to check my balance and saw an outgoing transaction for $1,500. My heart sank. As a finance professional, I am meticulous about money. I checked the transaction history and saw the transfer was made the previous night. I turned to Mark, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mark, where did you transfer $1,500? Mark, who was eating, paused for a moment and then said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, "Oh, I gave that to Mom. She said it was for an investment club with big returns." I put down my spoon. "An investment club? Why didn't you tell me?" Mark frowned, looking annoyed as if I were interrogating him. "It's only $1,500. Why are you so worked up?" "Only $1,500. I heard him, and my heart turned cold. To someone else, $1,500 might be a small amount. But what hurt wasn't the number, it was the way he dismissed my hard work and my right to know as a partner in this family. I walked straight into my mother-in-law's room. Carol was watching TV, holding the remote, and still smiling when she saw me enter. "Liv, my dear, why the long face?" I said, "Mom, that investment club money. What is it for? If you needed money, you could have just told me. Why go through Mark without asking me?" Her eyebrows shot up. Her warm smile vanished instantly. She put down the remote, and her voice changed completely, becoming curt and sharp. "A daughter-in-law's money is the husband's family's money. You're being so calculating. You came into this house as a daughter-in-law, and you still want to differentiate between what's yours and what's mine?" I froze. It was the first time I had heard such a harsh statement in this house. She said it as if it were an unwritten law, as if I were the one receiving, not the one contributing. I tried to compose myself. "But that's my salary, Mom. I have the right to know what my money is used for." Carol laughed cynically. "You can even have a career because my son was willing to marry you. Without him, could you even be in this house?" That sentence was like a slap. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about devaluing my self-worth. I turned to Mark, who was standing in the doorway, waiting for him to defend me. But Mark just scratched his head and whispered, "Come on. Mom was just talking. Don't take it to heart. She's old." Again, don't take it to heart. I realized one thing. Whenever there was a problem, he would always choose a neutral position to avoid responsibility. But his neutrality was actually deeply biased toward his mother. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. Every time we ate, my mother-in-law would often make comments that sounded like jokes, but were hurtful. "If it weren't for my son, you wouldn't be able to sit in this house." Or, "A rich girl like you, once you become a daughter-in-law, you need to learn your place." One day, she looked me up and down and said, "You dress like that for work. Who are you trying to show off to? Do you want people to praise you?" Big shot. I didn't understand. I worked hard, dressed professionally. What was wrong with that? But I kept quiet because I was afraid that if I argued, Mark would accuse me of being disrespectful, and the atmosphere at home would become even more tense. The thing that suffocated me the most was how financial matters in this house automatically became my responsibility. Every time there was a family event on my husband's side, Carol would call Mark and say, "Tell your wife to prepare an envelope for your uncle and aunt." When a nephew got married, she would say it directly to my face. "Our daughter-in-law has a big salary, give a little extra so our family doesn't lose face." The roof needed repairs, a new cabinet needed to be bought, a nephew's tutoring fees needed to be paid. It all ended with one sentence. "You take care of it." Yes, I took care of it, not because I was rich, but because I thought family was a shared responsibility. I didn't want to be labeled as stingy. I also hoped that if I did good things, they would appreciate me. But no. Every time I spent money, they treated it as a given. There was no sincere thank you, no. "You've been working so hard for my husband." I started to feel like I was buying peace with my money. At family gatherings, my position became even clearer. Food would be served. My mother-in-law would always pull Mark to sit near the elders, pouring him drinks while boasting, "This is my son. He has a very successful career." Meanwhile, I would be placed at the end of the table with women I didn't know, or with the small children. If anyone asked what I did for a living, my mother-in-law would answer first. "Oh, she's just a regular office administrator." I felt sad and angry at the same time. I was a finance manager, not a regular administrator. But I kept smiling because I didn't want to cause a scene in front of the relatives. At night, I would sometimes lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and ask myself, am I a wife? A daughter-in-law, or an ATM in this family? That suffocating feeling grew stronger. I held on because I thought if I was patient, the house would be peaceful. But I didn't know that my patience was quietly turning me into a stranger within my own marriage. After the incident with the $1,500 investment money, I started living with a very strange feeling. On the outside, everything looked like a normal family. Breakfast in the morning, watching TV at night. My mother-in-law sat in her corner. My husband came home from work. But inside, I felt like I was standing behind a glass wall, watching them interact without being able to touch them. The more I tried to join in, the more I was pushed away in a polite but cold manner. The peak of that cold politeness was my mother-in-law's birthday last year. At the time, she hadn't planned a big 60th celebration, just a simple family dinner. I thought, regardless, she is my mother-in-law. As her daughter-in-law, it was my place to prepare it. I ordered a cake, choosing a model with soft yellow frosting and the words "Happy Birthday, Mom." I bought a bouquet of lilies with a few white roses to make it look elegant. I even ordered some of her favorite dishes: barbecue, rub chicken, lamb curry, and sweet and sour fish. I didn't do it for praise, but to maintain harmony, to let them see my good intentions. That night, the house was full of laughter and chatter. I was busy in the kitchen, going back and forth serving plates and pouring drinks. Carol sat in the middle of the living room like a queen, wearing a new dress, her hair styled in a neat updo. Mark stood beside her, busy greeting relatives with a proud look on his face. I saw the scene and felt happy too, thinking that family togetherness like this was a good thing. But when it came time to blow out the candles and cut the cake, my mother-in-law stood up to give a speech. I remember every word because it was like a thorn that has pricked my memory to this day. She smiled, raised her glass, and said loudly, "Thank you to Mark, my son, who made it possible for me to experience this day. He took care of everything for me. I am so proud to have such a devoted son." Everyone clapped enthusiastically. Mark beamed, his eyes sparkling. Meanwhile, I, standing less than 6 feet away from him with hands that still smelled of spices, suddenly felt like a shadow. Not a single mention of her daughter-in-law, not a word of thanks. It was as if this party had just materialized out of thin air, as if the cake and flowers had fallen from the sky. I tried to swallow, to calm myself. Maybe she just said that for the sake of appearances. Maybe it was an oversight. But by the end of the event, I was certain. A few aunts and uncles praised the beautiful cake, the lavish flowers, and the delicious food. Carol just smiled and said, "Yes, Mark prepared all of this." I heard her, and my heart sank. I didn't need lavish praise. I just needed a little acknowledgement. My daughter-in-law worked hard, but she deliberately left that out. When all the guests had gone and only the three of us were left, I gathered the courage to speak softly to my mother-in-law, very carefully, to avoid a fight. Mom, I was the one who arranged for the cake and flowers. When you said that, it made me sad. I wasn't blaming her, I was just expressing my feelings. Carol turned to me, her gaze turning cold, and then uttered a sentence that left me stunned. You're the daughter-in-law. Doing that is your duty. What is there to be sad about? You did it for this family, not for anyone else. I was speechless, not knowing what to say. Because in that sentence, I heard one thing clearly, I was not allowed to have feelings. I was only allowed to work. From that birthday onward, I started noticing another detail. Every time the house had important guests, I was always pushed aside. Sometimes Carol would tell me to stay in the kitchen to make things more convenient. Sometimes she'd say, don't talk too much in front of them, people will judge. Once, she even said it outright, my guests are all very prominent people. If you come out, you'll just be an embarrassment. Hearing the word embarrassment, I was choked up. I wasn't born into a low-class family. I am educated. I have a position at my job. But in her eyes, I was still someone not fit to sit at the same table, even though I was the highest earner in this house. The more I was pushed away, the more I wanted to keep my distance. I began to think seriously about our finances. One night, after my mother-in-law was in her room, I said to Mark, from now on, let's keep our finances separate. I'll still cover my share, but for expenses for your mom or relatives, we need to discuss it first. I thought Mark would understand, as it was a reasonable thing to do. But he immediately turned to me, his eyes wide. You want to be calculating with my own mother? She's old, and you still want to make rules? I asked. Am I making rules or am I setting boundaries? Mark slammed the table. Your attitude is the same as treating my mom like an outsider. I laughed, but tears were close to falling. In this house, who is really the one being treated like an outsider? I said nothing more. I felt so alienated in the house I had helped buy with my money and cared for with my energy. I walked through the living room, looking at the dining table, at the chair I usually sat in, and suddenly felt so small. But even so, in my heart, there was still a sliver of naive hope. Maybe Mark was just emotional, he'll understand later. Maybe my mother-in-law is just harsh, she'll soften up eventually. I still tried to hold on to that thought, because I didn't want my family to fall apart. I never expected that Carol's 60th birthday would come like a knife, slicing away that last hope. And I also never expected that the feeling of being an outsider, which I had suppressed for so long, would explode on the night I sat eating instant ramen alone, hearing my husband call and ask me to bring my debit card to pay a $5,000 bill. I hung up the phone and sat frozen for a few seconds. In my head, it wasn't anger anymore, but a strange, cold feeling. The kind of cold you feel when you realize someone has been underestimating you for so long that they no longer feel the need to hide it. I looked at the bowl of instant ramen in front of me. The noodles were swollen, the broth tasteless. I suddenly thought that my 8 years of marriage were just like this bowl of ramen. Warm at first, then slowly cooling, and finally leaving only a bland, bitter taste. But instead of rushing to the hotel as they expected, I did something very different. I opened my contact list and called my best friend, Sarah, who happened to be a manager at the Grandview Hotel. I didn't beat around the bush. I said directly, in a low but clear voice, Sarah, I need to ask you something honestly. My mother-in-law's 60th birthday party is there tonight, right? Sarah paused for a moment, then replied, yeah, Liv. I'm here right now. I swallowed hard. Is my name on the guest list? On the other end, there was a soft sigh, the sigh of someone who knows they have to say something unpleasant. Liv, your name isn't on it. And there's one more thing. Hearing the words, one more thing, my heart pounded. Sarah lowered her voice, speaking quickly as if afraid someone might overhear. Your mother-in-law specifically told the staff that if you showed up, they were to politely block you from entering. She said she was afraid of being embarrassed. I was stunned. I asked again, like someone who couldn't believe what they were hearing. Afraid of being embarrassed? Why? Sarah hesitated. She said, my daughter-in-law is just a regular accountant, she's not used to being around VIP guests. If she says the wrong thing, it could be humiliating for the family. I shot up from my chair, my legs trembling slightly. Not from weakness, but from rage that sent blood rushing to my face. A regular accountant. I had heard belittling remarks before, but none had cut this deep. I am a finance manager. I deal with business partners on projects worth tens of millions of dollars. I can support myself, but in my mother-in-law's mouth, I became a regular accountant, as if I only belonged in a corner of the kitchen. I suddenly understood. They didn't just need my money. They needed me to know my place. They needed me to be quiet. They needed me to be present, but invisible. I ended the call with a cold hand. I looked around the kitchen. This kitchen that I cleaned every day. This refrigerator that I kept meticulously organized. This dining table that I bought with my own money. But tonight, I was forbidden from entering a hotel ballroom for fear of being an embarrassment. I imagined the scene there. My mother-in-law sitting elegantly in her designer dress. Relatives laughing. My husband raising his glass with pride. Maybe they were talking about a happy family, about devoted children and grandchildren. While I, his legal wife, was sitting here eating cold instant ramen like a tenant in my own home. The phone rang again. It was still Mark. I answered. Before I could speak, he was already yelling. Are you here yet? They're waiting. Do you want Mom to be humiliated? Huh? Hearing the word humiliated, I wanted to laugh. I asked in a voice so calm it surprised even me. Humiliated by what? By not having enough money to pay, or by not daring to show off your own daughter-in-law? Mark was silent for a few seconds. I knew he understood what I meant. But then his voice rose again, the voice of someone cornered but still trying to sound powerful. Don't make things up. There's a reason Mom didn't invite you. It's better for you to just stay home and relax. I gripped the phone tightly. What's the reason? Tell me straight. Mark replied casually. The guests are all business owners, friends of my uncle, friends of my mom. What are you going to do there? You'll just stand around looking lost, asking clueless questions. It's just embarrassing. I laughed, a bitter laugh. I asked the question I had held back for so long. Am I your wife or a decoration? Am I a daughter-in-law or an ATM? On the other end, silence. A silence that lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for me to hear the music at the hotel, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter of people. Then he yelled, "Stop playing games and get over here." He added, "This is a final warning." A final warning. That sounded like a command. And in that moment, I saw the truth with absolute clarity. He didn't see me as a life partner to be loved and respected. He saw me as a tool to solve his problems. When he needed money, he called. When he needed to save face, he ordered me to come as the bill payer. But when he needed to show off in front of his relatives, I had to disappear so they wouldn't be embarrassed. I didn't argue anymore. I just uttered one sentence in a very flat tone. Go on and enjoy the party. Then I ended the call, decisively. Without trembling, without hesitation, I stood up and threw the rest of the instant ramen into the trash. The sound was quiet, but to me, it was the sound of my long-suffering patience finally snapping. That night, I didn't go to the hotel. I also didn't transfer a single cent. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and looked at the financial documents and things I had kept hidden for so long for the sake of family peace. And for the first time, I didn't tell myself, just let it go. I told myself, enough is enough. Because when others have already decided you're an outsider, you no longer need to exhaust yourself playing the part of an insider. And I knew that with just one move from me, my husband's entire family wouldn't know what hit them. After throwing away that bowl of ramen, I didn't fly into a rage, nor did I sit and cry as I usually would. I slowly wiped my hands, pulled out a chair, and opened my phone to look again at the text from Mark. Just stay home. Those 3 words now sounded like the official declaration of my role as the outsider they had branded me. I took a breath and called Sarah, my friend and the manager at the Grandview Hotel, again. I said briefly, "Sarah, if anyone calls asking about the payment, just give them my number." Not even 15 minutes later, my phone was ringing off the hook. An unknown number. I answered, and a polite man's voice came on. "Good evening, is this Olivia? I'm the manager in charge of the celebration at the Grandview. We'd like to confirm the outstanding payment of $5,000 so the event can proceed." I could sense the caution in his voice, the kind of caution from someone used to dealing with difficult guests but who had to maintain professionalism. I answered calmly, so calmly it felt cold even to me. "May I ask whose name the event contract is under?" The man hesitated. "Under Mrs. Carol Thompson's name." I immediately said, without beating around the bush. "All right, please inform them that I have not approved the payment of the remaining balance. The family did not invite me to the event, so I have no obligation to pay for it." On the other end, there was a moment of silence. I could hear him swallow before saying softly, "Understood, ma'am." But the family has requested we continue with the event. We need clear confirmation to avoid any issues later. I didn't raise my voice or curse. Please proceed according to your policy. If the funds are insufficient, stop the event. I will not be involved. After speaking, I ended the call and placed the phone on the table as if setting down a block of ice. I thought I would be trembling, afraid of being labeled as someone who had shamed her husband's family. But strangely, I felt a sense of relief, as if I could finally breathe after holding my breath for so long. I sat in silence, staring into the empty room. Then the phone rang again. This time it was Sarah. Her voice was low and fast, her tension palpable. Liv, things are getting messy here. The welcome toast just finished, and the MC was about to start the music again, but the manager came out and made an announcement. I didn't ask much, just said, "Tell me." Sarah continued, when the manager came out, music was playing. Carol was laughing, raising her glass to thank the relatives. Suddenly, the MC was signaled to stop. The whole room went quiet. The manager spoke very politely, "Our apologies. We hope the family can settle the remaining payment so the event can continue." You can't imagine it, Liv. Carol's face, which had been beaming, went completely pale. I listened without any sense of satisfaction, but in my heart, there was something that felt like justice being served. I asked softly, "How did Mark react?" Sarah sighed. He was pale as a ghost, just standing there frozen. The relatives started whispering to each other. Someone even snidely remarked, "Throwing a huge birthday bash but can't even afford it." I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't want anyone to be humiliated, but I was even more unwilling to be disrespected. The reality was, they had put themselves in this situation purely because they thought I would, as usual, show up at the right moment to save them. This time, I didn't show up, and in that instant, the image they valued more than me began to crack. While I was still listening to Sarah's story, my phone vibrated again. It was Mark. I answered. His voice was trembling, but he was still trying to sound harsh to mask his panic. "Are you playing games? Are you crazy? My mother is standing right here, you know." I could hear chaotic music and the murmurs of people in the background. I replied very flatly, "I'm not playing games. I'm just following a financial principle." Mark shouted. "What principle? You're causing a scene over just $5,000. I laughed cynically. "No invitation, no payment. You told me to stay home so I wouldn't cause trouble, right? So I'm at home." A moment of silence, then his voice dropped, a mixture of anger and fear. "Do you want my mother to die of shame? Huh?" I no longer argued in the old way. I enunciated each word slowly and clearly. "Mark, shame isn't about being short $5,000. Shame is when your entire family treats their daughter-in-law like an ATM. You called me to pay, not to celebrate with you." Mark seemed to be at a loss for words but was still trying to salvage the situation. Enough. Just transfer the money. I'll talk to Mom later." I cut him off. "No need. You just need to remember one thing. I am no longer the person who will quietly clean up your family's messes." From the other end, I faintly heard my mother-in-law's voice. Carol seemed to have snatched the phone. Her voice was shrill. "Olivia, do you want the entire family to laugh at me? Huh? Don't be such a wicked woman." I didn't shout back, just replied with a single sentence that surprised even myself with its coldness. "You're afraid of being laughed at by others, but why aren't you afraid of your own daughter-in-law getting her heart broken?" Carol was taken aback, then screamed. "You're the daughter-in-law, you should know your place." I sighed. "Knowing your place means mutual respect. You don't respect me, so don't demand that I know my place." I hung up the phone. This time, I no longer felt shaky. I just saw a truth with absolute clarity. A month ago, I had secretly separated our bank accounts and blocked Mark's supplementary card. Not to cause trouble, but to protect myself. And that night, as the hotel began to shut down the event, as the whispers started, as my mother-in-law stood frozen in front of her relatives, I finally understood. The moment I stopped propping them up, their entire facade of grandeur crumbled, revealing the emptiness within. For the first time in 8 years, I didn't run to save them from their shame. And for the first time, I felt like I was stepping out of my role as the outsider in my own family, on my own 2 feet. I had just hung up the phone, and the house was quiet again. Not a peaceful quiet, but the silence of a rope pulled taut, just waiting for a single tug to snap. I poured myself a cup of hot tea, sat at the dining table, and watched the clock. I knew they would be coming home, and they wouldn't come with an explanation, but with rage, and the feeling of being publicly humiliated. Then they would take it all out on me, as usual. The difference was, this time I had no intention of bowing my head and taking it. Around 10 p.m., the sound of the front gate being violently opened echoed from outside. It was so loud it startled me. The clicking of my mother-in-law's high heels on the porch followed, along with the sound of my husband kicking off his shoes aggressively. The living room door was shoved open with such force, it seemed they wanted to tear down the entire house, along with their anger. Carol entered first, her face flushed red, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her designer handbag was thrown carelessly onto the table. She didn't greet me, didn't ask anything, just pointed a finger straight at me, her voice a shrill hiss. "You did this on purpose to humiliate me in front of the whole family, didn't you? You are truly a wicked woman." I remained seated, holding my teacup, looking at her for a moment before setting it down very slowly. I didn't want this conversation to start with shouting, but I was no longer afraid of her shouting. Mark stood behind his mother, his dress shirt wrinkled, its collar damp with sweat. He didn't look at me directly, as if trying to swallow his shame. Only after seeing his mother scream and me remain silent did Mark join in, snapping, "You're being so calculating over just $5,000. What was the point of all this?" Hearing the phrase just $5,000, my heart felt cold again. It was the exact same thing he had said when he gave his mother $1,500 for that investment club. To him, money was a trivial matter as long as he didn't have to be responsible for it. But to me, this was no longer about money. I looked directly at Mark, my voice calm. "To you, it's just $5,000, but to me, it's about my dignity." Mark was silent. Carol immediately let out a cynical laugh. A bitter and condescending laugh. "Dignity? You're a daughter-in-law. What right do you have to demand anything? You came into this house, you should know your place." I lifted my head, looking straight into her eyes, not flinching. I asked the one question I had held back for 8 years. "So, a daughter-in-law has no right to attend the party, but she has an obligation to pay for it?" The atmosphere froze. I saw Mark's face turn pale. As if he had just been stripped bare in front of his own mother. Carol opened her mouth to curse again, but her tongue seemed to catch in her throat. The question was too direct, too damning. Mark slammed the table, trying to regain control. "Don't you be unreasonable." I stood up slowly. No need to slam the table, no need to shout. I just stood tall, looking at him as if looking at someone I had once trusted and loved, but who now only left me with exhaustion. Unreasonable is when you and your mother treated me like an outsider for 8 years. Unreasonable is when you let your mother say I caused trouble and forbade me from entering my own family's party. Unreasonable is when you only remembered me when you had a bill to pay. Carol suddenly switched from shouting to a cold tone, as if pulling out her final blade to threaten me. She pointed at the floor. "Whose house are you standing in to talk like that? This house is in my son's name. Who do you think you are to raise your voice?" Hearing his mother say that, Mark seemed to find his footing. He lifted his chin and added, "That's right. You live here because of me. Don't forget your place." I heard him, and my heart ached for a moment, but it quickly passed, replaced by a sense of clarity. So, deep down, he really did think I was living off him. So, I had been trying to maintain a home they had always considered theirs alone. I smiled faintly. Not a happy smile. But a smile of someone who finally heard them say what they had been thinking all along. I looked at Carol, looked at Mark, and then walked straight to a drawer under the kitchen counter. Every step was steady, not rushed, not trembling. I opened the drawer, took out a thick, neatly bound folder, and placed it firmly on the table, right between them. The sound of the folder hitting the table was stark in the tense room. Carol stared at the folder as if it were something disgusting, then glared at me. "What games are you playing now?" I didn't answer immediately. I just asked softly. "You said this house is in whose name?" Mark frowned, about to open the folder, but I stopped him with my gaze. I didn't touch him. I just stared until he froze as if doused with ice water. I uttered a single, quiet sentence that landed like a stone. "There are things I haven't spoken about all this time. It doesn't mean I don't know." Carol's expression began to falter. She was still trying to maintain her harsh tone. "Who are you threatening? Do you think I'm scared?" "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just letting you find out for yourselves." Mark finally opened the folder anyway. I clearly saw the change in his face, from anger to confusion, then to panic. He read a line quickly, then lifted his head to look at me. "This is..." he stammered. Carol snatched it from him, her eyes scanning the document, and her face hardened instantly. I said nothing more, just stood there, letting the truth do its work. The house suddenly fell silent. No more shouting, no more table slamming. All that remained was Mark's ragged breathing and the sound of my mother-in-law swallowing with difficulty. Carol tried to speak, but I could hear her voice waver. What? What do you want? I looked at her, my voice slow, but firm. I don't want anything. I just want that from this day forward, you speak to me according to my position. I am a daughter-in-law, a wife, and a contributor. Not an ATM, not an outsider. Mark suddenly snapped, but this time his voice lacked conviction. What do you really want? Revenge? I shook my head. I'm not seeking revenge. I've just stopped being patient. I looked straight at both of them. And for the first time, I saw they were no longer standing tall, judging me. They were standing before a door they never expected I held the key to. And I knew that from now on, this confrontation was no longer about a $5,000 party bill, but about how they had treated me for 8 long years. I didn't need to shout to win. I just needed to present the truth and force them to face it. I didn't let them guess for too long. I pulled out a chair and sat down, facing them. I placed both my hands on the folder and pushed it firmly towards them. You said this house is in your son's name. Please, take a closer look. Mark opened the first page, his eyes darting across it as if searching for a single sentence to reassure himself. Carol snatched the document, as if afraid I would hide it. Just a few seconds later, I saw her lips tremble. She read the section with the owner's name, then lifted her head to look at me. Her gaze was no longer fierce as it had been when she first arrived, but a mixture of shock and confusion. On the deed of ownership, the name listed was Olivia Anderson. My name, not Mark Thompson, not Carol Thompson, not the Thompson family. The house they had so casually called my son's house. The Thompson family home was legally in my name. The document was clear, the seals were all there. I looked at them, my voice low but cold. This house was purchased with my parents' money, and is in my name. At the time of the purchase, I only asked Mark to co-sign the mortgage agreement so he could save face in front of the relatives. But to be honest, he was just a co-signer, not the owner. Mark looked as if he had just been punched in the chest. He flipped through the papers, his hands shaking violently, his voice hoarse. Why? Why did you hide this? I looked him straight in the eye, not flinching. Because you never asked. The words came out, and I felt a pang of pain myself. Pain because it was the truth. In 8 years of living together, he had never asked how I managed the finances to buy the house, pay the mortgage, and cover his family's various needs. He was just used to receiving, assuming it was all a wife's duty. And when there was a problem, all he knew was to say, just be patient with her. Carol finally found her voice, but it was no longer a curse. She growled. You deceived our family? I gave a small, humorless laugh. I didn't deceive anyone. I just kept quiet because I thought a family was a place for mutual support. But you used my silence to oppress me. I paused for a moment, then uttered the sentence I had been holding back all night. If I am an outsider, as you said, then you and my husband are welcome to leave my house. As soon as the words were out, the air in the room seemed to be sucked out. Mark shot to his feet. What did you just say? I remained seated calmly. I spoke very clearly. Mark snapped, but his voice was no longer as confident. Don't blow this out of proportion. This is a marital home. I asked back, a marital home? But when your mother threw a party, you told me to stay home so I wouldn't cause trouble. A marital home? But you called me to pay a bill like you were ordering a delivery service. Mark fell silent. I looked at him and added one more sentence to make it clear. From this day forward, don't use the term marital home to force me to swallow any more humiliation. Carol clutched her purse, her eyes red with either anger or fear. Her tone shifted dramatically, a tone I'd seen her use before, first threatening, then softening to mush when she knew she had no more leverage. She said more softly, Olivia, dear, we're family. Any problem can be discussed calmly. If we act like this, people will laugh at us. Hearing the word family, I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. I cut her off immediately, not letting her pull me back into the circle of saving face. When you were planning the party, did you consider me family? Carol opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't answer. Mark looked at his mother, then at me, his eyes full of confusion, like someone who had lost his footing. He tried to save the situation. Liv, I was just angry earlier. I was just talking nonsense. Don't take it to heart. I tilted my head and asked one thing. Were you angry, or have you been thinking that way for a long time? Mark was silent. His silence told me everything. It wasn't just tonight that he had belittled me. He had been belittling me for a long time. It was just that before, I wasn't firm enough to force him to admit it. I stood up, pulled the folder back to my side, and straightened it as if setting a new boundary. I said clearly, I'm not kicking anyone out tonight. I'm not as cruel as you think. But from now on, everything has to be clear. I looked directly at Carol. If you want to keep living here, you may. But as a mother-in-law who respects her daughter-in-law, not as the mistress of my house. Then I turned to Mark. Mark, if you want to continue living here, you may. But as a husband, not as someone who orders his wife to pay a bill and then forbids her from attending a party. Carol began to truly panic. She looked around the house, at the sofa, the refrigerator, the dining table, as if realizing for the first time that she had no control over any of it. Her lips moved. What? What else do you want? I answered briefly. I haven't done anything yet. I've just told you and Mark the truth. I paused for a moment, then added in a voice as soft but firm as steel, and the truth is, I'm no longer afraid of being humiliated. Mark swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. He murmured, Olivia, you've changed. I looked at him. There was no more burning anger in my heart as before, only a deep exhaustion. It's not me who has changed. I've just stopped being a fool. After saying it, I felt that the words were painful. But if it wasn't painful, I would just go back to the same cycle. The atmosphere was thick. For the first time, I saw them afraid. Not afraid of my shouting, but afraid of my calmness. Afraid of the clear document, afraid because I no longer ran to patch up their image. But within that fear, I also saw something else begin to grow in their eyes, resentment and a wounded pride. I knew very well that tonight's problem was not over. They would not give up so easily. And I was no longer the woman who would apologize just for the sake of peace at home, like I used to. That night, after I had clearly set my boundaries, Carol and Mark stopped shouting. They trudged to their rooms, slamming the doors shut, but they didn't come back to curse at me again. I didn't need a verbal victory. I just felt that the house had suddenly become more spacious, so spacious it felt cold. I cleared the table, washed the teacup, turned off the kitchen lights, and went to my room. But I didn't go straight to sleep. I knew that when people's paths are blocked by the truth, they don't automatically become good. They look for another way. And that other way is usually a dirty one. For the next 2 days, the house was eerily silent. Carol no longer made sarcastic remarks, didn't call me to the kitchen, nor did she hurl her usual sharp words. She just sat in the living room watching TV, her face as cold as stone. Mark would come home from work, eat dinner, and go straight to his room without looking at or speaking to me. If this were the old me, I might have been happy, thinking they had learned their lesson, and the house was finally at peace. But I wasn't happy. I could see clearly that this silence was not peace. It was the calm before the storm. Like someone holding their breath before throwing a knife. On the third night, I went down to the kitchen for a glass of water and accidentally overheard my mother-in-law talking on the phone in the living room. Her voice was no longer shrill like it was during our fight, but lowered to a hiss, the kind of voice someone uses when they're plotting something. I stopped behind the door. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the first sentence that reached my ears sent a chill down my spine. Listen, Judy. The house is in her name. Now, if we want to get it back, we have to attack her weak spot. I heard another woman's voice on the other end, likely her sister. Carol continued slowly, every word sharp. We have to ruin her reputation. If she's hit with a scandal, she'll back down. She's terrified of being embarrassed in public. I stood there, petrified. So, in her mind, this was no longer a matter between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. This was a power struggle, a war in which she was willing to use slander to bring me down. I didn't go out. I backed away slowly to my room, pretending I hadn't heard anything. But from that moment on, my vigilance went to a different level. I was no longer thinking naively about maintaining harmony. I knew they were preparing to attack. A few days later, Mark suddenly started acting nice, with a palpable fakeness. He didn't apologize, but he didn't pick fights either. He would say a few gentle words, as if testing to see if my heart had softened. Once, he asked, "Are you tired?" I heard him and found it almost funny. For 8 years I had shouldered everything, and he had never once asked that. Now he was asking, not out of concern, but because he was afraid I would actually kick them out of the house. I just replied with a short, I didn't want to show that I was on guard. A week later, on a Monday morning, just as I arrived at the office and before I could even turn on my computer, HR called me. The head of HR sounded very serious. Olivia, please come to the executive conference room immediately. There's something that needs to be clarified. Hearing that, my heart pounded. I work in finance. I know exactly what the word clarification means. I walked to the conference room with a heavy feeling. Inside were the CFO, the head of internal audit, and someone from the legal department. No one was smiling. They placed a folder in front of me. The head of audit said directly, "The company has received an anonymous report stating that you are suspected of embezzling project funds." I was stunned. Embezzlement? I repeated, as if I had misheard. They pushed the folder towards me. The letter was written in great detail. It wasn't just a general accusation, it mentioned project names, transfer dates, and even accused me of manipulating data to withdraw money through a proxy account. I turned to the next page and saw something that made my blood run cold. A copy of my old bank statement along with screenshots of transactions from several months ago. This kind of information was impossible for an outsider to obtain. To get it, someone had to know exactly which bank I used and what transactions I had made. I sat up straight, trying to remain calm. In my mind, there was only one thought. Only an insider could know this. I'm not the type to show off my bank statements, let alone bring them home for everyone to see. But they had lived with me, had seen, heard, and investigated for so long, and they were using that proximity to stab me in the back. I asked, "Where was this letter sent from?" The legal representative replied, "It was anonymous. But because the contents are so specific, the company has to follow up according to procedure." I nodded. Procedure was procedure. I didn't blame the company. I just felt a chill, thinking about the hands behind all of this. That evening, I went home later than usual. As soon as I walked in, I saw my mother-in-law sitting in the living room, holding a teacup. Her face was calm in a frightening way. She looked me up and down, then uttered a sentence that sounded light but was laced with venom. "When a working person gets a scandal like this, who will trust them anymore? Right, dear?" I stopped in my tracks. I didn't ask if this was her doing, because I knew she would deny it. But that sentence was a declaration. She had attacked, and she wanted me to know. Mark came out of his room, glanced at me, and then quickly looked away. His gaze was avoidant. It wasn't the look of someone who knew nothing. It was the look of someone who knew, but was pretending not to. That night, I lay in bed, but couldn't sleep. This was no longer a domestic issue. They had dragged my career into it. They were attacking the very thing they thought I feared losing: my dignity, my reputation, and the career I had built with my own sweat. I knew their goal perfectly. If I panicked, I would soften. If I was afraid of losing my job, I would give up. If I was worried about a scandal, I would retract everything I had said and go back to being their obedient walking wallet. But they didn't know one thing. I could be patient, I could yield. But I wasn't foolish enough to let someone trap me a second time. And since they had chosen to play dirty, I realized I could no longer just defend myself. I hadn't played my final card yet, but that card would make them understand the consequences of toying with someone else's dignity. That night, after hearing my mother-in-law's jab about the scandal, I didn't argue. I went to my room, locked the door, and sat at my desk. It was a deeply ingrained habit as a finance professional. When a problem arises, don't panic, check the data. I opened my laptop, accessed all my cloud storage accounts, and pulled up my entire transaction history for the last 3 years to examine it line by line. I knew that the anonymous report was designed to bring me down by creating uncertainty, to make me afraid because I didn't know what evidence they held. But I was different. I was only afraid of things without proof. As long as it involved numbers, transactions, and documents, I had a way to uncover the truth. I created a spreadsheet, filtering all outgoing transfers from my personal account that I had once considered household money, money for mom, or money for that investment club. I clearly remembered the $1,500 transaction from last year, because that was the first time I felt truly disrespected. I traced the history of that transfer, matching the date and time. The more I looked at the recipient's name, the colder I felt. The recipient was not any investment club. It was an account in the name of a relative on my mother-in-law's side, matching some information I had vaguely overheard her discussing on the phone once. I double-checked and then cross-referenced it with other transactions. $500, $700, $1,200. They all followed the same pattern. The money left my account, but its purpose was unclear, and most importantly, it was not used for our shared living expenses. I didn't jump to conclusions. I knew that to counterattack, I needed solid proof. I called an acquaintance who worked at a notary's office and asked him to check the legal information on a piece of land that my mother-in-law had bragged about a few months ago. I still remembered her words at the time, which I had dismissed as just talk. Our family will have land soon, so the grandchildren can be proud. At the time, I didn't ask further, but now I needed to know where that land was, and in whose name. Just a few hours later, my acquaintance sent me a piece of information that left me speechless. The land was in the name of Carol's younger brother. And the down payment date matched the dates of the transfers from my account. My back felt cold. So, the money taken from me under the pretense of helping mom with investments and family needs had ended up flowing into an asset in someone else's name, completely unrelated to my married life. I had no more doubts. I began printing and saving all the proof. Transfer receipts, transaction histories, message screenshots, and even some voice recordings I never thought I would use. I organized it all meticulously, as if preparing a file for an audit. Because I understood that if I fought with emotion, I would lose. Only documents could silence them. The next day, I proactively contacted a lawyer through a recommendation from a colleague. I didn't go into a long story, just got to the point. I've been slandered at work. And I suspect a family member is behind it. I need legal advice on defamation and asset protection. The lawyer asked if I had proof. I replied, I do, I just need the right strategy. With just that one sentence, I felt like I could breathe again. At least I was no longer alone. After the consultation, I went home without showing any hostility. I continued to cook, to work, to act normal. I didn't want them to know how far I had gone. Deceitful people are usually most afraid of one thing. A secret they thought was safe has already been exposed. I maintained a calm facade, so they would remain off their guard. My mother-in-law still sat in the living room, occasionally glancing at me with a probing look. My husband still avoided me. I let it be. I didn't need their confession. I needed them to walk into the trap they had set for themselves. A few days later, I quietly sent a message to a few of our closest relatives, the ones who had a voice in the family and, most importantly, still had a sense of justice. I didn't badmouth anyone. I just sent a short sentence. This Sunday, I'd like to invite you all for lunch at my house. There is something I need to clarify to prevent it from becoming slander. I deliberately chose the word slander. Anyone hearing it would understand this was no longer a simple domestic issue. That evening, I sent a short text to Mark. On Sunday, I want to speak frankly in front of everyone. Just a few minutes later, he called me, his voice hurried. What are you planning now? Marital problems should be solved between us. Why bring the relatives into it? I replied calmly. Because you and your mother have already brought my company into it. I have no other choice. Mark was silent for a moment, then lowered his voice. Don't blow this up. I'll talk to Mom. I laughed cynically. Since when do you talk to your mom? Before I could put the phone down, my mother-in-law was standing in my bedroom doorway. She must have overheard part of the conversation. She crossed her arms and smiled smugly. What drama are you trying to stage now? I looked at her, not flinching, not begging. I just replied with one quiet, clear sentence. This time, it's not drama, Mom. It's the truth. The smile on her face faded slightly, but she still tried to act tough. What truth? Don't make things up. I didn't argue. I just closed the door, leaving her standing outside with her frustration and confusion. The night before that Sunday, I sat alone in my room, looking back on my 8-year marriage like watching a long movie. There were parts I had intentionally cut out to lessen the pain. There were times I blamed myself, thinking maybe I was just too sensitive. But looking back now, I knew I had lived well. But I had lived among a family that did not see kindness as something valuable. They saw it as a resource to be exploited. I told myself, not to steal my heart, but to keep my sanity. If it had to break, let it break with honor. I could lose a marriage, but I could not lose myself. I organized all the files, preparing what needed to be said, what needed to be proven. I didn't need to shame anyone with words. I just needed to show them that everything leaves a trail. And when those trails were laid out in a straight line, no one could deny it anymore. They wanted me to bow my head, but that Sunday would be the day they would be the ones to bow theirs. On Sunday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was excited, but because I wanted everything to be perfectly arranged, as clear as the way I was preparing for the conversation ahead. I cooked a warm pot of chicken noodle soup, prepared a few simple side dishes, and set the dining table nicely. I didn't do it to please anyone. I did it because I wanted to. When they walked into my home, I wanted them to see me living honorably, not like the troublemaker they accused me of being. Towards noon, the relatives began to arrive. Some sat in the living room, others helped me set out plates. I greeted them naturally, my voice friendly, not complaining one bit about my personal problems. The calmer I was, the more confident I felt. Because I knew that whoever got emotional was in the weaker position. Carol arrived last. She wore a dark lace dress, heavy gold jewelry, her hair in a neat updo, and her face heavily made up. She walked into my house as if it were her own territory. As soon as she sat down, she looked me up and down and, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, delivered a line meant to pressure me. If you want to apologize today, I will forgive you. Don't cause any more embarrassment. The entire living room fell silent. A few relatives exchanged glances. Some frowned. I remained standing, my hands resting on the back of a chair, looking at her without a smile, without anger. I just saw clearly that she hadn't come to talk, but to force me to my knees. Mark sat beside his mother, looking awkward. He tried to smile to break the tension. Olivia, don't be so emotional. Every problem has a solution. We're mother and daughter-in-law, after all. No need to be so tense. Hearing the words mother and daughter-in-law, I felt a bitter pang. When they needed money, I was ordered to pay. When they needed to protect their image, I was called mother and daughter-in-law. I sat down facing them, without any preamble. I placed my phone on the table, turned on the voice recorder, and looked straight at both of them. Today, I will not argue. I will only speak with evidence. As soon as I said that, I saw Mark's eyes blink rapidly, while Carol fell silent for a moment. Deceitful people are most afraid of the word evidence. I took out a folder and placed it neatly on the table. This is the anonymous report that was sent to my office. I spoke slowly and clearly so everyone could hear. It accuses me of embezzling project funds, complete with copies of old bank statements and internal information. I lifted my head and asked directly, not accusing, not pointing, just getting to the heart of the matter. Who did this? The room froze. The expressions on some of the aunts' and uncles' faces began to change. This was no longer about a disrespectful daughter-in-law or a harsh mother-in-law. This was an issue that could involve the law, my reputation, and my livelihood. Carol immediately played the victim. She raised both her hands, her voice feigning shock. My goodness, if you have enemies outside, you should deal with them yourself. Why blame your mother-in-law? I'm an old woman. What do I know about filing reports? I didn't argue with her. I just looked her straight in the eye and replied with one sentence. I'm not blaming you. I'm just asking. Because an outsider couldn't possibly know these details. She was about to curse again. But I didn't let the conversation devolve into an argument about a disrespectful daughter-in-law. I quickly changed the subject, picked up my phone, and made a video call. On the screen appeared the face of Sarah, the manager from the Grandview Hotel. She greeted me, and then I said, in front of everyone, Sarah, please recount what happened at my mother-in-law's birthday party the other day. Were there any special instructions from the hotel regarding me? Sarah looked a little awkward but then spoke clearly. Yes, Olivia. The family instructed us that if you arrived, we were to politely prevent you from entering the event. The entire room broke into murmurs. I didn't look at anyone. I just let her words hang in the air. Sarah continued, her voice soft but clear. The person who gave the instruction was your mother-in-law, Mrs. Carol Thompson. She said she was afraid you would be an embarrassment because the guests were all very important people. Carol shot to her feet as if doused in gasoline. This girl is lying. You were bribed by her, weren't you? I cut her off, my voice still calm. Mom, you don't need to curse at anyone else. Just answer. Yes or no? Carol stammered. I just wanted the event to be orderly. She's too sensitive. At that moment, an uncle, the oldest and most respected among the relatives, who was usually quiet, turned and asked Carol directly. A birthday party where the daughter-in-law is ordered to pay but isn't allowed to attend. Do you think that's right? The question was like a hammer blow. Carol froze, her face turning from red to pale. Mark, seeing the situation turning against them, tried to interject and change the subject. This is a family matter. Let's not discuss it in front of everyone. We can handle it privately. I turned to Mark, a faint, bitter smile on my face. Privately? Then why did you drag my company into it? Mark was taken aback. I continued, each word spoken not loudly, but sharp enough to cut. You want this to be a family matter, but how could you stand by and let your wife's career be destroyed? The relatives who heard this began to look at Mark differently. No longer as a devoted son, but as a man implicated in a dirty game against his own wife. Carol tried again, this time with tears, her voice feigning distress. You're being so cruel. You want to slander your mother-in-law in front of everyone, huh? I'm not slandering you. I just responded truthfully. You don't look bad because of what I said. You look bad because of what you did. The room fell silent. I knew that if I got emotional now, it would just turn into a regular fight. I wouldn't let that happen. I stood up, pulled back my chair, looked around at the people sitting there, and then said firmly, "From this moment on, I will no longer argue. I will prove it." No one spoke. I could hear everyone's breathing. Carol gripped her hands until her knuckles turned white. Mark sat stiff as a statue. The relatives stared at me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern, as if they all felt a bomb was about to go off in the middle of this house. And I understood that the hardest part wasn't speaking, but keeping my voice from shaking as I prepared to tear down the curtain they had used to oppress me for 8 long years. After I said the words, "I will prove it," the entire room seemed to hold its breath. I didn't let the silence linger, because the longer it lasted, the more time they had to twist the story into one about a disrespectful daughter-in-law. I opened the first folder, took out a stack of neatly bound bank statements, placed them in the middle of the table, and pointed directly at a highlighted transaction. "This is the $1,500 transaction that Mark said was for your investment club." I spoke slowly and clearly. "And this is the recipient's account." I tapped my finger gently on the account owner's name. "It's not any investment club. This is an account in the name of a relative on your side of the family." Whispers rustled through the room. An aunt leaned forward to get a better look, her eyes wide. An uncle let out a heavy sigh, as if in disbelief. Carol shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "You're making this up. That money was for the investment club. I manage the money in this family, for the good of the children and grandchildren." I didn't argue. I just replied to the essence of her statement. "If it was for an investment club, you could have been honest from the beginning. You didn't need to use a relative's name to take money, and you certainly didn't need to teach Mark to take his wife's money and give it to you as if it were normal." I moved to the second page, showing other transactions. $500, $700, $1,000, $200, complete with dates and times. This wasn't a one-time thing. It happened repeatedly, and it all flowed in the same direction. Mark sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on the floor as if blinded. I didn't stop at the money. I knew that if I only focused on the money, they would say, "You're making a big deal out of such a small amount." I picked up my phone and played a short audio recording, edited to the exact part I needed. My mother-in-law's voice came through clearly, a venomous hiss. "The house is in her name. We have to hit her with a scandal, so she gets scared and lets it go." The living room seemed to freeze. Some people's mouths hung open. Others stared straight at Carol, as if seeing a stranger. I immediately stopped the recording, not letting it play a second longer, and then lifted my head. "Are you still going to say I'm making this up?" Carol's face went white, then ashen. She slammed the table hard, as if trying to regain her power with noise. "You eavesdropped on my conversation. You have no respect." Hearing the words "no respect," I suddenly felt a wave of sadness. Sadness because she was so used to using insults as a weapon to bring me down. But this time, I didn't tremble. I answered briefly, each word landing with clarity. "Disrespect is when someone tramples on another person's hard work and then calls it a daughter-in-law's duty." Mark, panicking, stood up and reached for the folder on the table as if to snatch it away. "Olivia, that's enough." I looked him straight in the eye, my voice not loud but sharp. "Mark, you touch that, and I'm calling the police right now." The entire family was stunned. They probably never expected me to dare say such a thing in front of the relatives. But I said it not to threaten, but to stop the hands that were so used to twisting the facts. I wanted everything today to be straightforward. The evidence on the table was not to be torn up by anyone. I moved on to the most important part. The part I knew would turn the entire room. I placed the anonymous report on the table, and next to it, a printout of the login history I had requested from the IT department for our shared family email. The report sent to my office wasn't fabricated. I said, looking directly at Mark. It was sent from an email address only known to insiders. The device used to send it. I pushed another piece of paper towards him. "Was your laptop, Mark?" This was a direct hit. I saw Mark stammer. His lips trembling, his eyes darting around wildly. I didn't let him wriggle out of it with the excuse that he was framed. I cut him off firmly. "The sending device was your laptop. Don't tell me the laptop flew and sent it by itself." A relative muttered, "My God." Someone else turned to Mark with a look of disappointment. Carol slumped in her chair, her hands clutching the arms. There was no way to deny it. Carol immediately changed tactics. She started to cry. But the tears flowed with a practiced regularity, her voice feigning a hoarse whisper. "I only did this because I was worried about my son. Since he married you, you've never respected him. You never listen, you never give in. I heard her and just felt tired. When they were wrong, they called it concern. When I fought back, they called it disrespect. I looked around at the relatives, then looked straight at her, delivering the line I had prepared. Not a shout, just the truth. You were concerned about your son, but you taught him to betray his wife and destroy her career. Is that concern, or is that destruction? The sentence landed, and the room fell silent. The hot-tempered uncle slapped his knee and said loudly, "If that's true, then you've gone too far, Carol." Another chimed in with an annoyed tone. The daughter-in-law did nothing wrong. Why treat her like that? I didn't need anyone to defend me. But when the truth was revealed, even their own relatives couldn't stay silent. Carol began to truly panic. I saw that this panic was no longer feigned. Her eyes darted wildly, her lips were dry, her speech faltered. Mark sat slumped like a man who had run out of energy, his shoulders sagging. I kept my voice flat, concluding my presentation with one short sentence so everyone would understand my purpose. Today, I am not accusing anyone. I am only saving myself. Because if I had continued to stay silent, the one who would have lost their job, their dignity, and their future would have been me. After I finished speaking, the atmosphere in the room was still heavy as stone. But I knew this burden wasn't over. I saw it clearly in my mother-in-law's eyes. Besides fear, there was something very dangerous, a shattered pride. And a person with that kind of pride, when cornered, will usually try one last dirty trick. And my suspicion was correct. Carol began to gasp for air. Her hand clutching her chest, her eyes rolling back as if she were about to faint. The moment Carol started gasping and clutching her chest, the living room erupted into chaos. She slumped back in her chair, her eyes rolling, her mouth stammering. I can't breathe, she wheezed, her voice deliberately weak, a weakness designed to make others panic. If this had happened a few years ago, I might have panicked, apologized, felt guilty, and blamed myself for speaking too harshly. But this time, watching the scene unfold, only one very clear memory came to mind. Every time my mother-in-law was cornered, she always had a signature trick, faking a feint to force others to back down. Then, after recovering, she would act as if nothing had happened. I didn't just stand there. I immediately took out my phone and called for an ambulance because I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being cruel and letting my mother-in-law die. But at the same time, I gave a subtle glance to Sarah, whom I had intentionally invited as a witness, to start recording everything. Sarah understood immediately. She discreetly raised her phone, recording from the moment Carol clutched her chest to every word spoken by everyone. I did it not to humiliate, but to protect myself. Because deceitful people don't play dirty just once. Mark knelt beside his mother, shaking her shoulders. Mom, what's wrong?" Carol's breathing was shallow and ragged. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth was still moaning weakly. I feel so sorry for my daughter-in-law. She put so much pressure on me." As soon as those words came out, I saw a few relatives turn to me with hesitant looks. I understood. She was trying to cast me as the villain. Once again, if I lost my composure, I would lose. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice flat. "Everyone, calm down. I've called for medical help. If anyone has smelling salts, please give them to her, but don't crowd around." In the midst of the chaos, I bent down to tidy the papers on the table, a professional reflex, afraid of losing evidence. And in that exact moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Mark, though his mouth was calling out to his mother, his hand was stealthily reaching for a stack of papers at the corner of the table, folding them quickly, and shoving them into the pocket of his suit jacket. His movements were swift, practiced, as if it had been planned. I blinked, my heart pounding. I knew exactly what those papers were because I had just placed them on the table, a draft of a separation agreement and documents related to our assets, which I had prepared for transparency. I didn't have to think hard. I just knew that while his mother was fainting, my husband was stealing documents. A seamless team effort. I immediately walked towards the door, blocking Mark's path. My voice was cold but not loud. "Where are you taking those, Mark?" Mark was startled, his face flushing. And he immediately snapped to cover his nervousness. "Are you crazy? My mother is dying, and you're still worried about some papers?" I looked straight at his jacket pocket, then into his eyes. "Your mother is dying, but your hands are steady enough to steal the deed to the house." That sentence was like a gunshot. The entire room turned. Some gasped, others froze. The uncle who had been quiet until now suddenly shouted, "Mark, what games are you playing?" Mark's face went pale. He stammered. I was just afraid the documents would get lost. I smiled faintly and said clearly, lost, or altered? Mark glared. You're talking nonsense. I didn't argue. I held out my hand firmly. Give them back. Mark hesitated, glancing at his mother as if asking for help. And right then, something happened that sent a shiver through the room. Carol, who was supposedly unconscious, suddenly moved slightly. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened a fraction, her eyes darting towards Mark. I saw it with perfect clarity. I uttered a single, quiet sentence, as sharp as a knife. Fainting but can still hear. Her health must be excellent. The relatives gasped in shock. One cousin, so annoyed, muttered, "Oh my God, she was faking it." Carol immediately squeezed her eyes shut again, trying to breathe more heavily to cover it up. But this time, her act was exposed. Mark, cornered, shakily pulled the papers from his pocket, still trying to defend himself. "You've gone too far, Olivia. You're humiliating the entire family." I looked at him, my voice calm to the point of being chilling. "It's not me who's humiliating our family. It's you. Because you had the audacity to steal documents in front of all our relatives." Just then, the paramedics I had called arrived. They came in, checked her blood pressure, and asked a few basic questions. Carol tried to continue her act, but the blood pressure cuff showed a normal reading, just slightly low. The paramedic said clearly. In front of everyone, her blood pressure is only slightly down. She'll be fine with a little rest. There are no signs of danger. That conclusion was like an official stamp on their lies. The room fell silent, and then the whispers exploded even louder than before. Some shook their heads, others sighed, and some stared at Carol with a mixture of anger and disgust. Carol could no longer pretend. She opened her eyes, her face now truly pale. Not from illness, but from having her mask ripped off in front of her entire family. She sat up straight, her voice hoarse. I was just feeling dizzy." A female cousin muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "Dizzy," but still had time to tell her son to hide the documents. Carol fell silent. Mark hung his head low, his ears burning red. I took the documents back, clutched them tightly, and looked around. "I'm sure you have all seen for yourselves. I don't want to prolong this issue. But if I wasn't vigilant today, I could have lost my dignity and my assets in an instant." The atmosphere was heavy. And I knew that drama had changed everything. Before, they could still make excuses about a disrespectful daughter-in-law or a stressed-out mother-in-law. But after the moment Mark stole the documents while his mother faked a medical emergency, all their defenses became ridiculous. I looked at Mark, my voice dropping. I asked him one thing. "Mark, was I ever your wife, or was I, from the very beginning, just a resource for you and your mother to exploit?" Mark didn't answer. He stood silent as a stone, and his silence was clearer to me than any confession. After my question, the room was no longer buzzing. It felt heavy, as if a large boulder had been placed in the middle of the house. My mother-in-law sat slumped in her chair, her hands wringing the hem of her dress, her eyes darting around wildly. Mark stood near the door, his face pale, his hands still trembling from being caught. The relatives looked at each other. No one was inclined to defend them anymore with excuses like, "It's a family matter, solve it peacefully." They had all just witnessed a fake fainting spell designed to create a diversion to steal documents. This was no longer just a dispute, it was a conspiracy. I took a deep breath and then said what I had prepared since the night before, even though my heart still ached to say it in front of so many people. "I will be filing for divorce today." I said it slowly and clearly, without shouting, without tears. Just a decision. Mark looked as if he'd been doused in ice water. He stepped forward, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. Are you trying to kill me?" I looked at him. There was no more overflowing anger, only exhaustion and clarity. "No," I replied firmly. "I'm just stopping you from killing me a little every day, killing me with humiliation, with exploitation, and by holding my dignity hostage." A few relatives sighed heavily. Some nodded, almost imperceptibly. I knew they understood. Because they too might have lived in relationships where the word family was used to force someone to endure suffering. I placed the folder in my hands on the table, straightened it, and then looked directly at Mark, my voice firm. "I won't drag this out. I'm giving you two options, in front of everyone, so no one can say I was cruel." I held up 2 fingers, explaining point by point. 1. You sign an agreement to move out of this house within 7 days. You take your personal belongings, you do not touch any documents, and you do not cause any trouble. I paused. 2. I report the case of defamation and attempted asset theft, complete with the video recording from just now. If that happens, this is no longer just a family matter. Mark's eyes widened, as if he couldn't believe I would dare say that in front of our relatives. He growled, "Are you threatening me?" I shook my head. "I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you. Because I have seen how far you and your mother are willing to go." I turned to the others, my voice still calm. "Uncles, aunts, please be my witnesses. I am not speaking carelessly. I have all the documents and the recordings." At that moment, Carol finally reacted. Not with insults, but by suddenly sliding from her chair and kneeling on the floor. The sound of her knees hitting the tile was a dry thud. She began to cry, and this time, the tears were real. Her voice was broken. "Olivia, dear, I was wrong. I was just emotional. I was just worried about my son. I was afraid he would suffer." The room was shocked. An aunt rushed to help her up, but she remained on her knees, as if trying to trade that position for forgiveness. If this were the old me, I might have given in. But seeing that scene, my heart no longer wavered as it used to. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt that it was all too late. I didn't scold her. Didn't yell. I just uttered one quiet, clear sentence, enough to make Carol freeze. "If you truly loved your son, you would have taught him to be a good man." Carol looked up at me, her eyes red, her lips trembling. I didn't let her change the narrative into one of a pitiful old mother. I continued in the same tone. "You didn't teach him to love his wife. You taught him to use his wife as a tool. So, I ask for your permission to no longer be a tool." Mark then switched to threats. The kind a cornered man uses, wielding his pride as a weapon. "Don't think that just because you have money, you can do whatever you want." I looked at him, not with anger, just with coldness. "Money doesn't give me the right to do whatever I want," I said. "But money and documents give me the right to protect what is mine, and to protect my dignity." I took out my phone and opened an email from my office that I had received that morning. I showed the screen to the nearest relatives, then turned it to Mark. The message was brief. The board was suspending the initial investigation because I had provided evidence of being framed, and the IT department was now tracking the source of the anonymous report. I looked him straight in the eye. "You're not just going to lose a house, Mark. You're about to lose your reputation." Mark stood frozen, as if something were choking him. He wanted to speak but didn't know what to say. Because threatening a woman when all she has is feelings is easy. But threatening a woman when she has evidence, a lawyer, and a strategy, that threat only reveals desperation. Some relatives began to speak up. An uncle looked directly at Mark, his voice firm. "Olivia has lived a good life. Why should she suffer because of this family?" Another aunt shook her head. "A husband and wife playing these kinds of games? Where is the love in that?" No one was shouting, but those words were enough to make Mark hang his head and Carol sob uncontrollably. This time, there was no act. She reached for the hem of my pants, her voice hoarse. "Give me a chance." I gently removed her hand, not roughly, but firmly. "I already gave you a chance for 8 years." I stood up and gathered all the documents into my bag. I called my lawyer in front of everyone, saying only briefly, "Sir, please come over and help me handle the procedure as we discussed." Without any more words, I looked around at the relatives and bowed my head slightly. "Thank you for coming. I apologize that lunch is cancelled." Then I turned to Mark and Carol, and uttered my final words for this chapter. My voice wasn't loud, but no one would ever forget it. "From now on, don't you ever call me your daughter-in-law when you need money. I am no longer playing that role." A week after that day, the house felt much emptier. There was no longer the sound of slippers shuffling across the floor every morning. No more TV blasting from dawn. No more probing stares as I left my room. The air in the house was no longer tense. It was so quiet I could hear the wind whistling through the window cracks and the hiss of the electric kettle boiling. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in the house I had bought myself. Mark had moved out as agreed. He no longer argued or threatened. He just quietly packed his clothes and a few boxes of personal belongings. Before stepping out the door, he paused for a moment as if he wanted to say something, but then decided against it. The door closed behind him. There was no drama, no commotion, just a very soft click. But to me, it was the closing sound of a long, 8-year journey. I walked into the kitchen and stood in the same spot where I had once sat eating a cold bowl of instant ramen on my mother-in-law's 60th birthday. I looked at the table, the chair, and the corner of the wall where the yellow light had fallen that night. Back then, I had felt so humiliated, so degraded, with nothing to hold on to. Today, standing in the same place, I no longer felt shame. I only felt pity for the person I used to be. Pity for a woman who tried so hard to be part of a family that she forgot that she herself deserved to be respected. On a Saturday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Mark. I stared at his name for a long time before answering. The voice on the other end was deeper, no longer curt or demanding like before. I was wrong. I never thought it would come to this. I listened, and my heart no longer churned as I had imagined it would. I wasn't angry anymore. Nor did I hope he would kneel and beg for forgiveness. I just said slowly, each word gentle but clear. You think of me as a place to return to whenever you have no other options. But I'm a person, too. On the other end, there was a long silence. Then he said softly, I understand. I didn't know how much he truly understood. But at least those words no longer sounded like a self-defense. A few days later, I received a text from my mother-in-law. For the first time, she didn't use a commanding or blaming tone. She wrote that she had been emotional, afraid of being embarrassed, afraid of losing her son, and never expected things to go so far. She apologized. I read it all the way through, but didn't reply immediately. I held no grudge. I just understood that some apologies come after someone has already broken something, and some cracks, no matter how much cement you add, can never be made whole again. I still did one thing that might surprise many people. I personally transferred a small amount of money to a nurse I knew to take care of her for a few days, because I heard she had genuinely fallen ill from the shock of that day. I didn't do it out of duty as a daughter-in-law. I did it out of my conscience as a human being who had once lived under the same roof. When relatives asked, I told them frankly, I'm helping because I want to be a good person, not because I want to go back to my old role. Saying those words, I felt a sense of relief because I realized I was in control of my own choices, not being forced. I began to rearrange the house. I changed the locks on the front door, not because I was afraid someone would come back, but because I wanted to mark a new beginning. I replaced the curtains with a brighter color, opened all the windows wide to let the sunlight in. The living room, which used to feel heavy, was now bright. I cleaned the dining table, wiped every surface, every drawer. Each movement felt like I was reclaiming space for myself, no longer a space filled with vigilance, sighs, and hurtful words. At the office, everything slowly returned to normal. The board confirmed that the report was slanderous, and the IT department had traced its source. The initial whispers gradually faded. I didn't have to explain myself to anyone. I just needed to do my job well, as I always had. The truth doesn't always have to be loud. It can arrive quietly, but once it is clear, it has the power to extinguish all rumors. There were nights when I sat alone in the living room, listening to the ticking of the wall clock without feeling afraid of being lonely. I realized one thing. I wasn't afraid of losing a husband. I was afraid of losing the status of having an intact family. But what is the point of maintaining that status if it's built on painful patience? There are families where the harder you try to fit in, the more they want to break you to fit their mold. I was once broken like that. I used to make myself smaller, speak less, and be more patient, just to be called a daughter-in-law who knew her place. Looking back now, I don't feel like I've defeated anyone. I don't need anyone to kneel before me. I have only defeated my own habit of being patient to the point of forgetting my own value. I learned that being good doesn't mean letting others walk all over you, and forgiving doesn't mean returning to the same position you were in before.